You know, when they said Star Trek Strange New Worlds was going to be a throwback to Star Trek the original series, I didn't think that they would also bring back Dr. McCoy's racism.
I'm trying to thank you, you pointed-eared hobgoblin.
Hey there, interwebs, I hope you're all doing well. So this past weekend, San Diego Comic-Con happened, 2024 San Diego Comic-Con, in case you're watching this for some reason from the future, which, by the way, hello, nice to see ya. At San Diego Comic-Con, they had, as they do every year, a panel for the Star Trek franchise. And overall, I was super excited by a lot of the stuff that they showed at that panel. Like, they showed some Section 31 stuff, they showed some things for Star Trek Lower Decks, its final season, as well as announced that my girl frickin' Tawny Newsome is getting her own live action series. Like, hell yeah, I am very pumped about a lot of that stuff, and if you want to hear me talk about some critical thoughts that I have, but overall my generally positive thoughts on the Star Trek franchise right now, you can check out the video that I did that'll be up over here. However, this video is not going to be about that because, unfortunately, they released a clip for the upcoming Star Trek Strange New Worlds 3rd season that has got the internet a-buzzing, and not for good reasons, and it's something that I need to talk about because the issues with this clip are something that I saw as issues in Star Trek Strange New Worlds Seasons 2, and it is something that I really had hoped that they would become self-aware of for another season, and yet seems to have doubled down on for at least the clip that they showed us. It's something that, just to use the buzzword, I find to be incredibly problematic, especially for something to be Star Trek to be doing in the year of our Luigi 2024. And that is showcasing a bioessentialist view of the world that I think very much, if I'm being generous, stems from the creators of the show not having a understanding of the distinction between race and culture that I think a lot of people are rightly calling out with this clip that I just need to talk about. So getting into it, at the Star Trek panel, they released a clip for the upcoming Season 3 of Strange New Worlds, and it appears to be a clip from what has become a staple of Strange New Worlds season so far, which is the weird hijinks Spock/Vulcan-centered episodes. Season 1 had the body swap episode Spock Amok, which I loved, and then Season 2 had the episode that I'm much more mixed on for reasons that I'll talk about because it relates to this later on in the video, but the episode Charades, which is sort of the comedy of manners episode, where Spock becomes, in the words of the show, a full human and has to hide that fact to sort of deal with a Vulcan ceremony and this farcical comedy of manners thing going on here. That the comedy was great within, but had the same roots of problems that are going to be shown in this clip.
These are delicious.
But one could hardly call them traditional.
That is true. They have diverged from tradition a bit.
And I wish I could probably show full, like, bits from this clip, or at least just show you the full clip, but unfortunately, I'm sure Paramount will ding me for that, so I'm just going to show little bits and pieces, and if you want to check out the full clip for context, you can check it out up here. But in this clip, we have our Strange New Worlds characters do what has also become a staple of Star Trek, which is they take a hypo spray to begin to take on the features of another alien race. This has been something that's gone all the way back to Star Trek, the original series.
Honestly, this feels wrong. I mean, just please don't take any pictures of me.
However, in this clip, one of the things that we learn is that by taking this sample, they are presumably changing their DNA to become what the episode calls full Vulcans.
Spock is only half Vulcan, whereas the four of us
are fully Vulcan.
Is that not logical? Spock.
So there's a lot happening in this clip, not the least of which is Pike's amazing hair growth. Like, we thought we had Pike's peak before. We were unaware of the heights that we could get to with his hair. And actually, I fully stand that. We stand the Pike's peak here. That's not the problem. But the first of many problems in this clip is that we see that our characters, once they become Vulcans, again, through presumably some better explained DNA sequencing technology in the episode when we get the full episode, start to act like the Vulcans that we know. They start speaking about logic, they seem to have no emotions, and even say the word fascinating, which is the line that Spock always says.
My perception has increased.
Everything I once found dull now seems to be
fascinating.
poop.
And there's a few issues with this, both within canon and outside of canon. Let me talk about the canon argument, because it's the one that I honestly care the least about, but it relates to the non-canon one. In canon, Vulcans actually do feel emotions. They don't just not have emotions. The logic part of the Vulcan society is a cultural thing. Vulcans have chosen, because of the teachings of Surak, as we saw throughout all of Star Trek, decided to follow this spiritual path of enlightenment through seeking logic and trying to push down or even purge all emotions if they take the Kolinar to be able to reach some sort of enlightened state. And we know that this is a cultural thing, not just throughout all of Star Trek, but even more specifically in Star Trek Enterprise. We have this whole 3-episode arc where we sort of explain the differences in the Vulcans between the original series and the Enterprise, which is a prequel, in that episode. And we can see that there's differing interpretations of how people think about logic based on this sort of basically pseudo-religious text from Surak that leads them down different paths to thinking about what enlightenment through logic means. Like different interpretations of a religious Bible text.
The culture you come to know isn't the one I helped to create. My people have strayed, and someone must restore them to the path.
But even if we don't want to use Star Trek Enterprise, go throughout all of pretty much Star Trek, the original series, but even into other Star Trek series like Star Trek Voyager with Tuvok, we have very clear discussions about how Vulcans do have deep emotions, that logic for them is a cultural, spiritual style process that helps them direct emotions in a specific way.
The Vulcan heart was forged out of barbarism and violence. We learned to control it, but it is still part of us.
We even see this literally portrayed as a spiritual, almost quasi-religious aspect of their culture through the rituals that we see in episodes like Amok Time or the movie The Motion Picture or The Search for Spock with the robed Vulcan priests that we meet there. Even further, we can also even look at the Romulans in Star Trek, who are essentially the same species but an offshoot of Vulcans. And the Romulans do have emotions and have built instead a hegemonic culture around ideas of distrust and suspicion. Something that is then even more complicated by the Zhat Vash of Star Trek Picard, who are a group of Romulan nuns who have their own counterculture against the Romulan hegemony that values trust and openness and honesty over everything.
La Hokiun, Urzornech Varet Viun.
And all of this showcases how the extreme logic element of Vulcan society is not inherent to their species, but simply one of numerous cultural expressions that their species has developed over time. So what makes it weird then is that when our characters take this DNA sequencing thing, they suddenly become logical Vulcans, which canonically makes no sense. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't care about canon if you can tell me a good story. So that's one that I'm like, as a Star Trek nerd, that's there. But I think this is a much deeper issue if we talk about what this kind of represents, because what it's saying is that this cultural aspect of Vulcans is a part of their literal bodies, their literal DNA. It's coded into them to who they are. And that is a very bioessentialist view of the world. For those of you who don't know what bioessentialism is, it's this view in Western society that, there are certain traits that are coded into, your DNA. And it comes up in very problematic ways, I think most especially of black people are like this.
Blacks are 23%. They make up 75% of the population. 75% of all shootings, 70% of all robberies, and 60% of all violent crimes. All right? The whites, only 3%. Now, that is why there were more blacks in jail than there are whites. But that's okay. And now let me just finish here, and then you can go. All right? So we look at that statistic. All right? They turn it around. The racial demagogues out there turn it around that the blacks are being picked on.
Or hell, as a trans person, I think of boys are like this and girls like this, and so if you're born as a man and want to become a woman, you could never we know that boys and girls are actually different, and there's differences in them, and it's a very conservative talking point. And it's often used by bigots to sort of say, these people are that way, and justify it in whatever way they want. But it doesn't even need to be that overt. Throughout all of our society, we have elements of this, of again, boys are like this, girls are like this, they're just different. Boys will be boys. Just this pervasive attitude of, there's a certain way that we have to be. And certainly, our bodies, our genetics, do influence who we are in some way, shape, or form. But to sort of code it as, boys are this, girls are this, it kind of goes back to these sort of gender norms that our society tries to take as normal, or or through racialization, which is more pertinent to the Vulcans here. Racialization is things that like we have created these categories of race in our society, often to generate hierarchies. And racial distinctions as they appear today are rooted in colonial attempts to separate different groups to justify things like slavery or imperialism, to say things like the European white people would uplift the subhuman savages like black people who are inherently less human due to their different biology. Again, this was like nonsense that was said to justify the slavery and imperialism, and then the scientific pseudoscience came after. And you see offshoots and extrapolations of this mindset in sort of the racism that we see today. It's baked into our institutions. It comes up in everyday casual racism, or you can see it in its more extreme bigoted versions with people saying things like trans women aren't women because we're inherently biological men, going back to like the essentializing of men over women that comes from like a very Catholic, like Garden of Eden sort of idea of man and woman, that again centers in European style stuff. Or you can go to the white supremacist bullshit of black people being lesser than that we see throughout our society, both overtly in like neo-Nazi styles white supremacists, or even just subtextually in things like the GOP. I mean, look at how they're talking about Kamala Harris today. And you can even see it in more fascistic forms like the Nazism that we saw in Germany in the 1940s of Jews being a subhuman enemy, diluting the pure Aryan race. So for Star Trek Strange New Worlds to be leaning into this bioessentialist view of Vulcans is a deeply problematic one, because it sort of doesn't understand the distinction between culture and DNA and culturally created, socially created idea of race. Now, a lot of you out there may be saying, oh, well, this is a fictional alien species. Why do we need to care? Obviously, this is just trying to get to, like, we want to see our characters play Vulcans. That's a fun, funny bit. And I agree. It's a fun, funny bit to see Spike. I keep wanting to say Spike because of his hair. Pike, like, play a Vulcan, be all logical. Like, that's a fun bit. But you can get there, I feel like, without relying on this bioessentialism. And I don't want to just throw it to Star Trek Strange New Worlds as the sole problem within the franchise here. This is a problem throughout all of Star Trek. I think you can go through pretty much every single Star Trek series and see this thing crop up. Next Generation had this thing of like all Ferengi are greedy. You know, like little capitalist goblins.
You work with your females. Harm them.
All Klingons in the original series are like angry and aggressive. And to be fair to it, oftentimes Star Trek just presents these as monocultures of alien species, to say like just this one alien species has an entire culture that's like this, that is basically just doing that to use the alien species as like a metaphor for a single episode or whatever. And that in and of itself is its own problem, but Star Trek then leans into this further when it says things like these cultural aspects, such as Klingons having a warrior culture, which was in part inspired by like Japanese samurai, as being like an essential part of their biology. I mean, we see this in Star Trek Voyager very clearly with the character of B'Elanna Torres, who is a biracial human Klingon woman who is portrayed as hot-tempered and angry directly due to her being, having Klingon DNA.
If it doesn't work, hit it. If it's in your way, knock it down. No wonder I got kicked out of the academy. For which you should be eternally grateful. Well, I'm not. Your temper has gotten me into trouble more times than I can.
And this creates the problem within Star Trek to say that these aspects of culture are then racialized and then made to appear like pseudoscientifically biological. And that's just Star Trek, which is a franchise built on science, not understanding how biology and science and even social political elements work, which is sad considering the show is all about like science and social political dynamics. And Star Trek Voyager is even more problematic when you consider the character of Torres is also a Latino character, and there's a stereotype of Latino women being inherently hot-tempered that just plays into more of this bioessentialism stuff, or also how like Klingons generally throughout Star Trek are sometimes portrayed as like brutal, cruel savages, and they're uplifted by their proximity to a hegemonic Western-style culture like the Federation, with the Federation having like an almost civilizing aspect on the Klingons. That again, given the like Japanese influence of the Klingons, throughout its history, it certainly has its own racialized elements to it. given like America's own imperialistic influence within Japan. And again, that leans into these sort of very racist, bigoted, but also sort of pervasive ideas of people are a certain way that I think does not behoove the best of Star Trek. I mean, I think about Deep Space Nine, and one of the best aspects of Deep Space Nine is they did a lot to break that down. We would see in that show Ferengi, who did not fit the typical norm of like all fitting into the culture of, you know, capitalism and you know, being very obsessed with profit. And on Deep Space Nine, we mainly see through like the character of Sisko how Starfleet officers seeing all Ferengi as simply inherently greedy, as just part of Ferengi biology, was itself a racial prejudice. Like Sisko often racializes the Ferengi.
Ration types are all alike. You talk about tolerance and understanding, but you only practice it towards people who remind you of yourselves. Because you disapprove of Ferengi values, you scorn us, distrust us, insult us every chance you get.
Quark, I don't have to stand there and defend myself.
Tell me, Commander, would you allow your son to marry a Ferengi female?
I never thought about it.
Exactly my point.
And what Deep Space Nine does is it like breaks down that racial prejudice, but also sort of does this thing of like, yes, that we can break down that as a racial prejudice, but it's also worth noting like that there are cultural distinctions that maybe are a worthwhile point of critique of Ferengi's sort of more institutional hegemonic society, but it's not a part of just Ferengi's biology itself. And that's best done in like the Ferengi-centered episodes where we see like Quark having to come up against the problems of the institutions of the Ferengi and him wanting to live up to those ideals, but not always doing so because the Ferengi institutions are bullshit, because, you know, capitalism.
You wrote the rules of acquisition, the sacred precepts upon which all Ferengi society is based. Oh, you of all people can't expect me to break them.
Why not? They're just rules. They're written in a book, not carved in stone. And even if they were in stone, so what?
And it allowed us to sort of see the difference between culture and these sort of very racialized ideas that essentialized it in someone's biology. Like, oh, Ferengi, you're just that way. And I think the best stories around Vulcans in the original series also understood this too. Because a lot of these making fun of Vulcan stuff that we've been seeing throughout Strange New Worlds tend to center around the character of Spock.
I've been doing research on human sex.
And Spock's whole journey throughout Star Trek, what makes him a very quintessential Star Trek character, is his whole struggle throughout the entire franchise is this push and pull between his human part of his ancestry and the Vulcan part of his ancestry. And him trying to figure out, am I going to become fully logical, or do I hold on to this more emotional side of myself as a human? And
it's not human. Oh, that's not a dirty word. You're human, too. Let that part of you come through.
And in the midst of dealing with all of that, he also has to deal with prejudice that he faces from both human culture.
Compassion. That's the one thing no machine ever had. Maybe it's the one thing that keeps men ahead of them. Care to debate that, Spock?
And from Vulcan culture.
It is truly remarkable, Spock, that you have achieved so much, despite your disadvantage.
Throughout most of the original series, he pulls more towards being a Vulcan, and in the movies, he kind of like finds a better balance and pulls more towards human through his friendship with Kirk and McCoy. And by the end of Star Trek VI, the final original series movie, he kind of comes to this place of like, logic is not the end of wisdom, it's the beginning of wisdom.
Is that logical? Surely we must.
Logic is the beginning of wisdom, Valeris, not the end.
Something that he passes on to his younger self in the Star Trek 2009 movies.
In this case, do yourself a favor. Put aside logic. Do what feels right.
Even further, we see Spock in The Next Generation trying to pass on his personalized self-actualization journey that he's come to in a more macro-cultural context where he begins to try to work to unify Romulan and Vulcan cultures, like bringing together this emotional culture and logical culture, where he faces overt political backlash from the Romulan government, but then when we see in Star Trek Discovery, he ultimately succeeds in the long arc of history through the unification of Romulans and Vulcan society.
Spock believed that together you could create something bigger than yourselves. That's what this quorum is. That's what Navarre is. That's what the Federation is.
And it's a really wonderful discussion of, on a cultural context, how do you find, as a person who's in this liminal space between two very opposing ideologies, two opposing cultures, how do you find who you are as a person, and how do you sort of fit within this world? How do you find yourself? But I think the reason a lot of people related to Spock is that I think we all have that emotional journey throughout all of our lives. Of, you know, as a trans person, I related to it because I'm like, oh, I'm called to be told to be a boy, but I also like have things that I think are more feminine. I want to come out as trans, but also people who are not trans are also will struggle with like femininity and masculinity, or emotional, or are we supposed to be logical like boys are told to be? Like this is something that all of us relate to, this sort of like we have to be a certain way, but because we're told like that's how you're supposed to be, down to our biology, and who you actually are. And trying to be free of the societal expectations on you. That's what makes Spock such a potent character. To understand that through the lens of culture and expectations, I think is essential to understanding what that story and his story is about. And that was not always ubiquitous across Star Trek, but I think the best stories with Spock center upon that, with episodes like Amok Time, or Journey to Babel, where he's sort of struggling with his relationship with his father, and his mother being human, sort of like telling him it's okay to be emotional, you should reach out to your father, and his father's being very closed off. Or even the animated series episode where Spock goes back in time, meets his younger self, and has to sort of counsel his younger self through the death of his beloved pet, and like Spock dealing with the emotions of losing someone that he cares about, which is a very deeply emotional thing, but Spock as a kid didn't understand how to process it because of the Vulcan world that he lived within.
A Vulcan would face such a loss without tears.
How?
By understanding every life comes to an end when time demands it. Loss of life is to be mourned, but only if the life was wasted.
And these are all stories written by DC Fontana, or heavily influenced by DC Fontana, by the way, because DC Fontana understood the Vulcans very, very well. So it's a very important part of his character, and one that I think is essential to understanding who he is. And so when I look at these Strange New Worlds episodes, both what appears to be going on in this clip, as well as the last season episode Charades, where we have Spock becoming a quote full human, and suddenly he like has all these emotions, he acts fully human in like a stereotypical way.
Do I smell more human? I've already spoken to T'Pring and to your family. What did you tell them, Captain? Because T'Pring's mother, if she heard I was human, this could be a serious disaster.
Whoa. Like, starts even eating bacon, which is weird considering the Jewish-coded heritage of Spock. It was a very weird choice to make him eat bacon in that episode as, like, a human trait, because Vulcans have a sort of, from Leonard Nimoy, like, literally doing this, which is a Jewish symbol, having a very Jewish-coded nature to them. It came across as the writers wanting to have these, like, fun, farcical episodes of Spock that I love. Like, the comedy in those episodes, I think, are great. They're hilarious.
Don't test me, Kirk! I will break you! Clean it up.
But getting there in a way that misunderstands the potency of Spock, and I think dilutes Spock a lot. And in doing so, presenting racism uncritically, such as a section in the episode Charades where people try to teach Spock how to be Vulcan, and it comes across as them just teaching him racist stereotypes of what Vulcans are.
How to speak like a Vulcan. Like this. Flat. No emotion.
I am Vulcan.
Flatter. More robotic.
But because the series is treating all Vulcans by its own racial stereotype within the canon, this is presented without any sort of criticism, but just for comedy. And I don't want to entirely throw out that episode as, like, trash, because I do find not only the comedy great, but there is a great discussion around the prejudices that Spock's mother faced as a human on Vulcan, trying to raise a son who was seen as different. And I actually think the episode handles that part of it pretty decently well.
You were shunned by Vulcan mothers.
But you were happy. And her judgment was a sign of their own weakness, not ours.
But it's still sadly mixed in with the stereotypical racialization of Spock throughout the episode. And what's frustrating is that if you go back to season 1 of Strange New Worlds, they actually did this much better in that season. In season 1, they have the episode Spock Amok, where he switches bodies with T'Pring, and when Spock is in T'Pring's body, who is a quote-unquote full Vulcan, we'll get to those terms that why I'm quoting them in a minute later on, he doesn't act more, in fact, he acts just as emotional as he always would. He literally punches a dude who offends his fiancée in that episode, despite him being in T'Pring's body.
You listen here, you
Perhaps we should keep the details of how exactly we captured Barjan between us.
And so there's an understanding of like Spock's background and Spock's feelings don't necessarily change based on the body he's in. It's not something core to the body that he's within. It's who he is based on the cultural upbringing that he has had throughout his life. And I think this is brought even more thematically out in the episode that is one of my personal favorite episodes of modern Star Trek and Strange New Worlds overall, The Serene Squall, where he has a literal conversation with a non-binary character about this idea of like, he's not half human, half Vulcan. He is fully Spock. That's who he is. And the non-binary character literally says to him, like, you should just be you. That's what you should do. And it's sort of that's the core of his whole arc and what he'll be struggling with throughout his entire character arc throughout all of Star Trek.
Sometimes we act a certain way to fit people's expectations, but that's not necessarily who we are.
You are proposing I better balance my human and Vulcan natures.
I'm saying maybe you're neither.
And in that season understood this, both in the just like everyday like storytelling avenues that it did to get to its fun Spock episodes, and more deeply on a thematic level with Spock as a character that we very much lose in season 2 of Strange New Worlds. And the reason that that's even bigger of an issue is that it's a kind of problematic theme of that entire season, which is why I, despite liking a couple episodes of last season of Strange New Worlds, I'm very critical of that season, because you even have in that season episodes where you have Ortegas, who is the pilot of the ship, wanting to go down on an away mission and like sort of not just always be the pilot of the ship. And then that episode ends on this refutation of that, where Ortegas constantly repeats, I am Ortegas, I fly the ship, when she forgets her memory.
America, Ortegas. I fly the ship. Fly the ship? I am Erica Ortegas. I fly the ship.
And the point of the episode ends on, oh, she should be happy where she is in life.
Do the same thing every day. It's easy to forget how important that thing is, how awesome that thing is. I won't let that happen again. I'm Erica Ortegas, and I fly the ship.
And I certainly understand that being an element of like, yeah, you should find joy in where you're at in life. But by having it sort of being through this denial of what she's curious about, of like wanting to be on an away mission, wanting to expand her horizons, kind of adding this element of like, oh, she should just be happy here and not wanting to go and do anything else. She should fit the function she's here for, the Starfleet machine. And this gets reiterated throughout the season of like, even in the finale, she's like complimented for like how good of a pilot she is.
You were born for this, Erica.
Sort of like this like hat on a hat of like, yeah, you're a very good pilot, you should be very happy with that. And this even comes up in the musical episode, where the musical episode, it's why I hate the musical episode. I don't mind the musical episode as like a concept, but the musical episode ends on this theme of, we know our purpose is to protect the mission. We all have our roles to fit within Starfleet.
We know our purpose is to protect the mission.
And it kind of is this weird essentializing of who someone is, like, oh, you have a purpose to fit into this machine. Hell, there's even like a meta-textual issue with Star Trek Strange New Worlds Season 2, because since it's a prequel series, a lot of the characters, especially the legacy characters of Strange New Worlds Season 2, seem to have character arcs that solely focus on justifying their storylines from the 1960s. I mean, you have Nurse Chapel, who's a really cool character and giving such personality in Season 1, having most of her Season 2 storylines revolving around her relationship to Spock and them breaking up and that being a big emotional turmoil for them.
Like I've been trying to tell you, I just need some personal time.
I understand. You require personal time away from me.
Which is seemingly just there to justify the very 1960s original series version of Nurse Chapel, who was always lusting after Spock, because heaven forbid a woman in the 1960s have a storyline that isn't about wanting a relationship with a man, instead of, being the first officer of the ship that Majel Barrett had originally been cast as in the pilot of the original series. So, as a result of trying to justify that sexist storyline, Nurse Chapel of Strange New Worlds becomes just a character to just justify her canonical role in the franchise, rather than being a full character like she kind of had like inclinations to in Season 1. Hell, Season 1 of Strange New Worlds even had a storyline directly about Captain Pike having to get over the fact that he knows what his ultimate fate is of ending up in the BB chair from the original series, and him having to just come to the realization of like, he just has to live life as he takes it and not worry about his predetermined destiny. Like, be your own person. And then season 2 kind of like walks that back a little bit. And so we kind of see this doubling down overall in Strange New Worlds season 2, and then this clip from season 3 kind of showcasing further that you have a certain destiny, that institutions determine your destiny, your biology determines your destiny, even the franchise that you are involved in dictates your destiny, rather than what for me Star Trek has always been about, which is you as a person getting to dictate who you are and what you want to be. And I really think that that is a misunderstanding of what Star Trek should be. And to me, what Star Trek should be is, as we see in that second episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, where we have the character of Rutherford wanting to leave engineering and go and try out different jobs on the ship, to be like a security officer or to be a medical officer. The joke of that episode is every single time you think his superiors are going to be offended or angry that he wants to try a new job, but instead they go, "Oh my God, yes, please do that. I'm so here for you."
I'd like to request a transfer out of engineering.
Consider your request granted! Oh man, this is exciting. I'm sure wherever you end up, they'll be lucky to have you.
Aw, thanks, guys.
I mean, there's even a fact where, like, Rutherford joins the security team and gets called like a bear, like a little bear by the security chief. Throughout the entire rest of the series, he still calls him like, "Oh, hey there, baby bear." As like a term of endearment, that even though Rutherford at the end of the day still chose to be an engineer, he's still part of the family. And it was about Starfleet enabling who you want to be, not Starfleet dictating what role you had to play. And I think that that's a really important core message of what Star Trek is about, is that we celebrate diversity, we celebrate who you are, and we find a place within our society for you. We don't try to fit you into a specific role and tell you this is where you should be happy. And again, I don't think this is a conscious like thing within Strange New Worlds, but it is a repeated theme that I saw throughout season 2 that really bugged me, and bringing it into a bioessentialist element into that kind of ties into things that, especially as a trans person who hears that bioessentialist rhetoric from TERFs all day, again, I don't think this is their intention, but it rubs me really the wrong way. And two last things about this clip that the reason I wanted to have this big rant kind of ends on like, you know, all of this stuff that I'm talking about now could maybe be explained in the episode of like, maybe like there's like a part of the hypo spray that they take sort of gives them some cultural knowledge. I don't know. That would be a nonsense way to do it, but like at least it would like smooth over that issue a little bit for me. But I think there's a bigger core issue at the heart of this clip, which is the fact that as soon as the characters turn into what the episode calls full Vulcans, they immediately start shaming Spock for being half Vulcan. And it's a reiterated point throughout this clip.
How was the mission for you, Mr. Spock?
Ironic, because I was constantly reminded that I was logically the least Vulcan member present.
And this is a deeply problematic thing. One, it's racist. It's like, it's them being racist towards Spock, which like in the 60s when McCoy did it was a little like, okay, it's the 60s, haha, they're being racist towards a fictional alien species. But like here with these repeated themes, it's like, we should have a better understanding of why that's not okay. Number one. And number two, it's like, where did these characters learn that racism? Like, oh, suddenly now they're quote unquote full Vulcans and they learn this racism towards Spock. But even deeper, it's gets to this point that you're calling Spock half something, like half human, half Vulcan. And, you know, it's something that I've described him as before, so I'm not shaming anybody for doing this, but it's something that I've learned a lot recently over the past few years, especially through my friend Spotted Giraffe, who is a big Trekkie as well, who is a biracial person, is that, you know, you shouldn't call biracial people half and half, because they're full people. They're not half this, half that. They're fully who they are. And that is something that we often sort of ascribe to biracial people, of saying like, you're a percentage, you're, you know, half of something, you're never a full thing. And it's a struggle that I know a lot of biracial people deal with. And for biracial people, this sort of idea that like, you're not a full person because you don't fit into these cultural contexts, you're just half of something, and it's equating that to biology is deeply frustrating. And this is something too, by the way, that I, as a non-binary person, relate to heavily, because I am often, as a non-binary person, told that I'm like halfway between a boy and a girl, when in truth, for many non-binary people, not all, but for many non-binary people, we don't see ourselves as half one thing, half another, but like something else. In fact, there are numerous different categorizations of being non-binary rather than one single binary identity third category that we're sometimes all lumped into. And this is something, again, that Strange New Worlds Season 1 textually discussed with Spock himself relating to a non-binary character on this exact point. And the reason that I'm calling Strange New Worlds out even more especially on this is that other Star Trek shows have actually done this well in recent memory. Star Trek Prodigy, I think, is the most overt one. Star Trek Discovery, I think, does a good job with this too. But Star Trek Prodigy in Season 1 had a storyline, minor spoilers for that show, where the character of Dal, has a mystery behind his background. He wants to meet his parents. There's even an episode where he sees some visions of his parents and he wants to meet them, but he's never seen them. And eventually he learns that he is actually the product of genetic manipulation, that he's had DNA spliced from a bunch of different species, and the reason he doesn't know his parents or know what species he's from is because he's one of a kind, he's unique, and there's no one else that looks like him. And this causes an existential crisis for him, because it's like, who am I? Where do I fit in? It's a very similar thing to Spock, but in a sense of like, there's no one else that looks like me. I don't have people that look like me. Who am I?
So I don't have any parents?
There's no one else like you. That's cool, right?
Tough break, kid. All this time. I'm just some failed experiment.
And Prodigy eventually comes out to have this point of like, you're you, Dal. You are who you are. And that's beautiful. And we can find a place for you within Starfleet for you that doesn't have to fit you into this box of you're this thing or that thing.
I didn't want to be a mistake. I just wanted you to look at me like you look at Okana.
You're not a mistake, but you'll never be as good as Okana. You're better. He left us. You didn't.
Now let's make you better.
And yes, but this season even deals with some institutional prejudices against Dal for being a genetically modified being, which is an interesting thing about how even Starfleet itself has institutional prejudices.
His name is Dal RL. Is he genetically engineered? Yes. Was he enhanced in every way? Look at him. Of course not. But his heart is bigger than any in this room.
But the core ethos of the show Star Trek is about challenging those prejudices and biases and systemic racism or systemic assumptions that are baked within it. Deep Space Nine was all about that as well. They breaking down the systemic institutional problems of Starfleet and the Federation and other cultures as well that try to put people into boxes. That was kind of textually what Deep Space Nine was about, and it's why it's my favorite Star Trek series. And the fact that Deep Space Nine did it, 20, 30 years ago, and Prodigy's doing it now, and yet Strange New Worlds is still doubling down on this very 1960s original series-esque racism. It's something that I'm disappointed in Strange New Worlds doing, and even more disappointed that it's a clip that they show as the fun, wacky Spock episode out of context. Hell, they even imply that Vulcans saying fascinating is something that's part of their DNA, which just reeks to me as categorizing all Vulcans this way because Spock was that way, so Spock must be representative of all Vulcans rather than Spock being his own unique person. And it's, again, a very racializing bio-essentialist stereotype made literal canon by the show, and I just think that that's a problem. And by the way, when I say I think it's a problem, I'm not sitting here these writers are racist. It's one of those things where I'm Star Trek should be about breaking these things down, not replicating them uncritically. Star Trek should be more textually about stuff like this rather than it just sort of being haha, we're gonna do a fun Spock episode and lean into these bioessentialist things. I'm not against the fun Spock episodes. Star Trek should be weird and fun, and not every episode needs to be a big political statement, but it shouldn't lean into problematic aspects that we should have been aware of since the 90s at the very least, just being replicated here. And, I'm willing to give Strange New Worlds the leeway of, when this episode comes out, maybe they'll have a better explanation for it. Maybe it'll be a better thing. And, hell, maybe even the whole point of that episode is, the arc of that episode is to get to this point of, it's actually racist to say Spock is a half Vulcan. Maybe the end thesis of the episode is literally breaking down, presumably based on that clip, it's sort of textually dealt with within the episode. So that might even be the point of the episode. But to do that point through a bioessentialist lens, especially when that season 2 had this problem, and to sort of choose that this clip to show to people as like the fun, wacky one out of context at San Diego Comic-Con, it showcased to me a potential lack of self-awareness that I really, 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 really want them to grapple with, because it is a very, it is a problematic element in my mind that, for me, and I'm going to, again, put this qualifier again, for me, goes against the grain of what I think Star Trek should be standing for. Now, again, that's a me thing. I'm not telling you that you have to agree with me on that. Like, everyone's allowed to have their own interpretation of Star Trek. But for me, Star Trek is about, and I think goes to, like, Gene Roddenberry's original quotes of, like, we should be taking delight in the differences of others and differences of life forms. And it's only then that we should be able to, we earn the right to go to the stars and earn that brighter future of Star Trek.
Like this, and it is a trip. Its loveliness is not in the sameness of people and things, but in their incredible variety. Eventually, this led me to the Star Trek statement, IDIC, infinite diversity from infinite combinations. Thank whatever created us. We are different, each of us and everything around us. To the end of time, if it ever does end, no combination will ever come up quite the same. That's quite a travel package. All of this is how Star Trek began, and it's also something of what it's about. I am an alien. And so are you. And yet, and this is the loveliest thing of all, somehow we're also part of each other and part of everything that is.
Like, that was something that Gene Roddenberry himself said. And I have many issues with the man, but that he got right. That's what I want my Star Trek to do. It doesn't have to be what you want it to be, but this is a problem that I think, you know, a lot of my friends and a lot of other people are sort of wrestling with this clip, and it's one that has me very tepid on season 3 of Strange New Worlds. And I hate saying that because, like, there's stuff about Strange New Worlds I love. I love season 1, and there's 2 episodes in season 2, the Lower Decks episode and the Courtroom episode, that I adore. But the rest of season 2 had this constant theme of, like, destiny, predetermination, bioessentialism, fit your role for the cog of Starfleet. You fit this role for both the canon of Star Trek, the world that Star Trek exists within, the role of Starfleet as an institution. Like, it just was a constant theme of that season, and it really kind of bothered me. And I had hoped that, you know, it was a fluke season and that season 3 could maybe right the ship a little bit for me. But this clip, and especially the choice to air it out of context without, like, understanding that that might be a take on this by the wider Trekkie fandom, showcases to me an ignorance that scares me for this season. All right, that's all. I've ranted enough about this, but I did want to talk about it. And like I said, I will have another video out that should already be out where I talk more positively about Star Trek, because I am very positive generally on it. But this clip in specific bothered me. So wanted to talk about with all of you. But what did you think? I'd love to hear all your thoughts. Give me all your thoughts down in the comments below. And beyond all of that, my friends, live long and prosper.